Welcome to special session 2 of the 8th Africa Regional Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction. This session is focused on improved understanding and management of disaster risks in Africa. With scarce resources and so many competing needs, having critical knowledge will ensure that evidence-based decisions are made to effectively reduce disaster risks. To moderate this session is Mr. Amos Makarao, the Director of the Regional Office for Africa of the World Meteorological Organization. The floor is yours, Mr. Makarao.
Yes, thank you very much. Greetings to you all. Welcome to this session. And as Delali has indicated, this session is entitled Improved Understanding and Management of Disaster Risk. This session is English, but there's also interpretation into French. And if there are any questions, please direct them to the chat box, and we will make sure that we attend to them as quickly as possible. Now, with me in this session, I would like us to welcome 4 speakers who will share their views on the production and use of risk information and to enhance planning for risk reduction and disaster risk management. So I will ask each of the 4 speakers to briefly introduce yourselves, please. Okay, Johan, you can please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson, Moderator. My name is Johan Mini. I work with the City of Cape Town. I'm the head of the Disaster Management Center for the City of Cape Town in South Africa. And a good day to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. Also, next to Gemma.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to everybody. My name's Gemma Connell. I'm the Regional Head of Office for OCHA, which is the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, covering 25 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. It's a pleasure to be with you all today.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Okay, Ahmed.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Hello, everyone. My name is Ahmed Amdihoun. I'm a program coordinator for disaster risk management with Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, the IGAD Climate Prediction Application Center here in Nairobi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Last but not least, we have Cynthia Eswatini. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Moderator. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sihle Mzileni. I'm the Head of Strategy and Sustainability at the National Disaster Management Agency in Eswatini.
Yes, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can actually see the quality of the moderators that are here, and therefore, please feel free to ask any questions, and I'm sure they will be able to answer them. So, among the objectives of this session is to demonstrate the importance of risk information for all DRR stakeholders to better deliver on their mandates. We will reflect on the diverse requirements for data, technology, methodologies, and any resulting risk information, keeping in mind that the risk information should be available to and accessible by all, particularly the managers, the planners, the investors, the communities, and also individual actors. But most importantly, it must reach the last mile. And so we will take stock of the knowledge products available to DRR stakeholders. We will require information to support decision-making at various different scales and levels. And I trust that this opportunity will give us a chance to learn from these initiatives where multi-hazard, multi-sectoral, cross-scale assessments provide strong evidence in support of planning and management of disaster risk. So definitely, so now we can actually go start the session because we have only less than 60 minutes. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll divide the session into two. I will first of all request Gemma and Ahmed, to give us their presentations, and this will provide a continental and regional perspective. And then Cynthia and Johan will then come in to discuss risk understanding and risk management from the point of view of the national and local DRR. So we're not talking actually regional as well as national. Like you said before, if you have any questions, please send them on the chat box, and we'll do the best thing if we can entertain them. So now, may I turn to Gemma and Ahmed, and to each of them, I have a question. To ask. So to Gemma, you are the head of OCHA's Humanitarian Planning and Operations in Southern and Eastern Africa. So what kind of risk information is required by humanitarian actors? In this case, maybe from my limited understanding, we're talking of maybe data, risk analysis, etc., etc. So you know better. And how does this collaboration with the other stakeholders help develop and apply risk information, which can be meaningfully support early action? And while you're thinking about it, Ahmed, this is your take. As the ICPAC is the IGAD Center for Climate, you are a regional body. You support member states with risk information, and you increasingly look into what is required for transboundary risk management, because we talk about disasters are transboundary issues as well. So in addition to that, you're talking about ICPAC's DRR unit as it collaborates with climate prediction team, food security teams, and others to ensure that you provide the most relevant risk information and to serve the diverse stakeholders. How do you construct the portfolio of your services and your products? So with these two, while you're thinking about it, I'll revert to Gemma, and then I'll come back to Ahmed. So Gemma, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair. So as you have asked me, I want to speak to what data do humanitarians need and how do we need it to be available? And I know I'm speaking to an audience that has tremendous knowledge and capacity, both with respect to the production of data, but also with respect to the production of risk profiles, forecasts, etc. So what I want to tell you today is about how, for us as humanitarians, all of that work that you all do can be extremely and immediately relevant, both for response, but also for preparedness. So there's three key points that I want to communicate today. The first is that we need data to be available, and the chair has already highlighted this in his opening remarks. Data is wonderful, but if it is squirreled away in one of your organizations or entities and not publicly available, there's a high likelihood that when we as humanitarians prepare for emergencies and respond to emergencies, we won't know that data is there. So an ask to all of you, from all of the work that you do, please make that data available. And I'll come back to what that looks like in just 1 minute. The second point I want to speak to is having data that we can understand. I'm speaking to you today as the head of office. I do not have a meteorological background. I don't have a scientific background. I have a humanitarian background. And so for the data that is produced to be usable for people like me, but also for the communities that we serve, and the chair spoke to that critical last mile, we have to find ways of translating technical data into data that is understandable both by humanitarians and by the communities that we serve. And the last point I'll speak to about today is how we need data that is immediately usable. both for, as I said, preparedness and for response. And when I say immediately usable, I mean a concrete product that we can take and insert as an inject into the planning that we're doing. So I'm just going to quickly look at each of those three things. I promise I won't take too long, but just to give you a couple of concrete examples. So in terms of having data that is publicly available, just to flag to the chair and the technical colleagues that my clicker doesn't seem to be working, but I'll try one more time. Otherwise, if you could move to the next slide, please. When we talk about publicly available data, I'm going to give you an example from the humanitarian realm. Many years ago, we did not share our data as humanitarians. We had data that was in disparate places across hundreds of organizations. And so when it came time to respond to an emergency, we each had our own bits and pieces of data, but there was no place where all of that was put together in a repository that we could access. So on the humanitarian side, in the last years, there's a center that's been established, the Humanitarian Data Center, that has pulled together all of the data sets that are available and made that publicly available for any humanitarian and anybody else, including DRR professionals, to respond to and prepare for emergencies. And you can see on the right of your screen what that has looked like in practice. When the work of that data center began, and even before that, the data exchange back in 2014, there were very few data sets that were publicly available and very few users of those data sets. And you can see through to June 2019 that there's been an exponential increase in the number of people using that data, but also not as exponential, but still gradual, an increase in the availability of data. Now, for this to work, we have to have data that is interoperable, and we have data that is of quality. And the last point, and this is a critical point, is we have to protect sensitive data. So we have to have standards to ensure that data that would affect someone's individual life, that may compromise their safety, that data, of course, should not be made publicly available in a way that could compromise them. But key point here, and an ask to all of you, from the meteorologists in the room through to those working on risk profiles, any of that work you're doing, please make it available, because then we will be able to use it. So let me then shift next slide to what we talk about when we mean data that is understandable. Now, what this looks like is going to be different from someone like me to a person who you can see on the screen, who is the end user, I would say, of data. And that is the person who is living in a community that's going to be impacted by a disaster. So these are actually two different products that are produced by the same source. On the left, you can see a flood forecast, and that's produced by Swalim, which is an entity that works on the forecasts for Somalia specifically. So on the left, you see the type of forecast that many of you in the room who work on meteorological issues are used to seeing. Where are we expecting the floods to be higher? Where are we expecting rainfall to be higher? Now, that's very, very useful for us as humanitarians, because we can look at that and start to plan geographically. But if I were Ahmed, who's on the right-hand side of the screen, and who doesn't have knowledge of what that map means, what the colors mean, why it's important, that piece of information would not be translatable to me as a person in a community who's potentially going to be impacted by floods. So Ahmed, who you see there on the right, actually received that same information, but broadcast in the local language by the radio in a way that he understood he needed to act. And so in 2019, he received a forecast through Radio Ergo in the local language, speaking to the potential of high rain. And on the basis of that forecast, he took action and evacuated his family and prevented losses. So just to say, oftentimes what I see, and again, I am no expert, is data that is presented in ways that are highly technical with a lot of jargon. And even for me, that's difficult to understand. So let's make sure that the data is produced and made available in a way that humanitarians without scientific backgrounds can understand and use. And then let's always think through languages. Do we need visual materials? Do we need oral materials? And how do we make that data truly available to the people whose lives depend upon it? And then if I can shift to the last slide and then I'll stop. When I talk about immediately usable, I wanted to give two examples of this. On the left-hand side, you have the type of forecasting that's produced through SARCOF, which is the SADC regional meteorological forecast for a season. Now, this data, again, is hugely helpful for us as humanitarians because we can take this. So we are now in November. This shows us the forecast through December, January, February, and we can see that there are several areas where we need to enhance readiness for potential floods. You can see that in that dark blue piece. So already when that SARCOF forecast comes out, we are taking that, just so you know, those of you who work long and hard on these forecasts, for SADC is one example, we of course have GARCOF in East Africa. We take that data and we immediately translate that into what our contingency planning has to look like. If that slide showed the opposite of below average rains, which is the case for parts of Southern Africa and Angola that you can see, then we start planning for drought. So just to say, we take that data and we immediately start to use it for preparedness. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, and this would be my very last point, is an example of when we're in the middle of an emergency, what are the types of information that we can use and that we can immediately act upon. And this is a product that was an experiment between various universities funded by the UK that was active during the last couple of cyclone seasons. And what you can see on the screen here is a product that we received during the tropical cyclone Eloise response, and which was also shared with the Mozambican government, which is critical. This product told us that while we were watching the floods in central Mozambique, especially of the Buzi Basin, which were already rising and potentially risking lives, there was another risk further south in Gaza province, which none of us were looking at. So why was this important? It meant that both we responded to the immediate emergency and had the information available to us to know which rivers were rising and when, but also it highlighted to us what had been a blind spot because we were so focused on the immediate response and made us prepare for those potential floods elsewhere. So immediate, understandable, and very, very quick to be able to be available to us at times of need, both for preparedness and response. Thank you so much, Chair. I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you very much, Gemma. Very well articulated. Data, and information. This is actually very critical. Okay, so because I'm mindful of the time, and so please, for the following speakers, please make sure that we can make sure we can do it in 5 to 10 minutes to allow our audience to also participate in the participants. So the next is Ahmed, again, a regional perspective. Please go ahead, Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, again, for the opportunity to speak. I have a slide if it can be uploaded. But as I bring in, I can start, particularly what I would like to bring in with this improved understanding and management of disaster risks is a regional perspective, particularly for Eastern Africa region, with respect to data and elements that we need to take into consideration. Maybe next slide, please. These are the few things that I think we need to bear in mind. The first and most important thing that I would like to start with is issue of this multi-sectoral and multi-hazard approaches. When we think of understanding risk particularly and managing risks, one thing quite essential is the synergies that we need to build on these multi-sectoral and multi-hazard issues. That is quite important. Now, for particularly for Eastern Africa region, the monitoring and forecasting products are quite important, as you all know. But this is, again, very much a work of, for example, for IGAD, providing an outlook, climate outlook every season, at least 3 times a year, and also providing advisories. As the previous speaker said, everyone don't understand the maps and the forecast and so on, but advisories are quite essential, quite important. With that regard, also, IGAD provides 2 things. One is the co-production part of it, where member states would be called in from each of the sectors, at least 7 sectors, and they sit and try to explain, try to understand the forecast and what it means, particularly for preparedness but also preparedness actually to act early and preparedness also for response. With that respect, I think there are several advances in terms of producing activities, so that you are sure that the products are understandable, particularly by stakeholders, primarily by the national governments, and anticipatory actions are also outlined and acted upon. That is, I think, the most important. The other one is, again, with more now towards understanding and managing risks. One thing quite essential is issues to do with elements of risk. I think when you talk about disaster risk management and so on, the elements of risk and data on those elements of risk is quite essential. The first one is the hazard itself. As I said, the monitoring products from ICPAC, for example, the forecast products from us and other institutions are quite important, particularly to be able to understand what is coming. Further, now what are at risk? What are the elements at risk now? That's quite important. What's exposed? Is it the population? Is it the key infrastructures, the crops, or what? That is, again, quite important. That's why actually we are collaborating, for example, with UNDRR to develop a regional risk profile. No matter how good forecast products we have, unless we have, for example, those important layers as exposure, vulnerability, and possibly coping capacities, we are not able to provide quite precise information with full understandings of what the risks or what the hazard can do to the communities. Recently, we have launched IGAD Disaster Operations Center, which has a situation room, particularly for a multi-hazard early warning system and early action. We are very much hopeful now that this situation room will be providing, at least starting with 4 major hazards in the region: the droughts, the floods, the pests, primarily the desert locusts, as well as the food security issues in the region. With that, I think we are heading to advance, actually, not only the early warning products, but also on early actions. Can we attach anticipatory actions whenever we are issuing forecasts? That is a task now on our table. And I think that's where things has to head, particularly from our institutional point of view. Next slide, please. This is, for example, the products which we just, it's a work in progress, but we just finalized and see the results quite recently. It's a collaboration between UNDRR, WFP, the Chima Foundation, and IGAD. This is, for example, what floods can do in the IGAD region, just in 1 year. You can look at the 1.5 billion cost to the GDP, about 600, almost more than 500,000 people affected every year, and so on, in croplands and so on. So it's really serious. This is an annual loss and damage that we are anticipating out of this climate, this risk profile, flood risk profile. This is at current climate. You can just imagine what that means in the future climate. So that is very important. Maybe next slide. These are, for example, the products that Mr. Moderator has put a question on for me. This is, for example, the one you see on the left is exceptionally heavy rainfall forecast that ICPAC issues every week, which are very important indicators of any risk of flooding, particularly in the regions. As I said, this is not enough. It has to be done in conjunction with exposure, vulnerability, and other layers, but it is quite important. At a weekly scale, it's quite precise, to be honest, from our experience. And this can be a very good piece of information, piece of data that humanitarians and other actors can in-bank their anticipatory actions well in advance. In my opinion, currently there are really good changes that we are focusing more on anticipatory, or let's say forecast-based actions. That is where the future should head, rather than, as we know, for example, in our region, billions and billions of dollars are still being invested on the humanitarian side, while quite few millions are on the anticipatory and the DRR side. I think that imbalance has to be corrected, and there are good progress, starting with WFP and other OCHA and other partners. We have seen a good orientation towards that loading approach in terms of dealing with disasters. My last slide is, next slide, please. Yes, in terms of the portfolio and the products that that IGAD and ICPAC are providing, particularly we have this platform, what we call East African Hazard Watch, where almost all products are being uploaded there, and particularly quite easy to understand from an average user point of view. But going forward, I think this product has to be again simplified, more understandable, particularly for local communities and so on. That is maybe the next phase of it, but particularly for web-based users, this is what has been offered as a portfolio of IGAD and ICPAC. But as I said, this is not enough. We have to attach the forecast and monitoring products into anticipatory actions, which are actionable, which are to be followed up by all stakeholders. That is when we say we really have a full understanding of risks, and we also have a full understanding of disasters. Thank you very much, Chair, and I hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ahmed. Now you can see the link between OSHA and your institution. We are regionally based, and both of you talked about one thing which I was very much happy about. Like, for example, Gemma talked about the data center. In other words, one-stop shop, one-stop of all data repository. That's excellent. And you are also talking about actually having a situation room. Okay. So obviously we are heading in the right direction. Thank you very much for this. And also you talk about the hazards, the watch, those things. So definitely from a regional perspective, this is really very, very pleasing that at least something is being done regionally. Now, maybe, while we wait for the comments to come in and mindful of the time that we have available, I will now come to the next two speakers, who will speak from a national perspective. And so I'll start with you, Sinhle. Eswatini is the National Disaster Management Agency. In one of the roles of this agency is to coordinate and support the diverse humanitarian and development stakeholders in Eswatini. The pandemic has made us acutely aware of the many challenges when managing cascading and compounding hazards. And decision makers, for example, have to face uncertainty on a daily basis. And this is a very big task for your agency. So my question to you, Russell, is how does a national authority understand systematic risk, and how can it work with stakeholders in the country to manage risk across different sectors in the different scales? So now you are moving out from the region to the national perspective. So Cynthia, if you are there, please, the floor is yours. 5 to 10 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator, and the participants in this session. Actually, our conceptualization of managing risk in Eswatini is that we take the discipline of risk management as a construct to sustainable development, of which our approach, it ensures that we mainstream disaster risk reduction or disaster management within the overall national development agenda. We also take reference to the global policy frameworks, particularly the intent of all 4 of them, as well as the Africa Agenda 2063, to be encouraging mainstreaming of disaster risk management to all development sectors of our economy. So our approach is embedded on that. We needed to understand the risk comprehensively in accordance to all of its elements, so that we can be in a position to formulate strategies that can enable us to prevent new risks, reduce the existing ones, as well as managing the residual risks. So within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been dealing with a situation whereby we were having double onsets of the COVID-19 pandemic and direct impact of the tropical cyclone Eloise, as well as a tropical cyclone Kenneth, which had some devastating impacts in the country while we did not experience direct impacts. So we can safely say that Eswatini, ever since the 35-year period, actually, we've been managing disasters in the country. We haven't experienced this double onsets. So basically, our approach then is that we needed to understand disaster risk in all its elements. We are profiling the hazards, and we are working with all the development sectors of the economy, working through what we call the sector-wide approach, whereby these development sectors are the ones that are leading actually the disaster risk management efforts at sector level. So basically, we have taken a disaster risk management as purely a governance issue, since you know that there are many drivers of disaster risk, and particularly poor disaster risk governance has been mentioned as one, and we've identified it in our context. So we have worked towards ensuring that we address that driver. Then secondly, we are intending to strengthen a national early warning system. That is why we want to understand all our risks in all its elements, particularly vulnerabilities in all the dimensions of vulnerability, being the political, being the environmental, the economic, social, as well as the institutional, to enable us to formulate policy as well as strategies that can be relevant enough to enable the country to effectively deliver in terms of managing risk comprehensively. So basically, we want to also ensure that we have identified that our strategies, they needed to be inclined towards strengthening the information management system, of which data and information are critical elements to informing policy as well as to informing strategy. And we have also determined that really we needed to come up with a robust risk financing mechanism in the country to ensure that all the risks, particularly the impacts, can be adequately addressed with a resilient financing mechanism that exists. So basically, our approach is that we need to deal with risk management in its comprehensiveness, particularly considering the evolving bioepidemiological risks that are happening. And over above COVID-19, there are certain risks of diseases evolving in the neighboring country, South Africa, of which we are having direct links. So basically, we need to ensure that with those direct trade links, we position system to ensure that we prevent them from gaining onset within the sovereign boundaries of the country. So basically, we would like to highlight that really our approach entails to ensuring that we support all development initiatives to be sustainable. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Cynthia. Very well articulated, particularly at the national level, when talking about understanding risks, all risks, and also issues to do with the national early warning, as well as strengthening information, and as well as financing. Now, I'm assuming that national early warning unit, I'm assuming therefore that SADC, or even UNDRR, have a regional early warning unit, so that you can work together, particularly in the area of capacity development. So definitely, I'm sure listeners are very much interested in what you have said. And if there's any questions, please feel free to chat. And also, so now my next speaker is Johan. You are next, and you are the city manager of Cape Town. And for your information, my PhD was in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town, and so I like Cape Town very much. It's almost my third city after Nairobi. And this is a city where issues related to systematic risks, they resonate with many. Okay, now risks are changed among those who contribute to resilience building, but also among those who created the risk. We know that urban sprawling you're talking about now, of late, we've been seeing disasters increasing in the urban area. So I'm sure Cape Town is also one of them. So what tools and methodologies are most promising in allowing city managers and local stakeholders to translate science into policy and into resilient investment. So now you're talking about what do you need, what are the enablers in order for you to make sure that you provide Cape Town as a disaster resilient city. Over to you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I enjoyed Nairobi as well, so mutual admiration for hometowns there. Thank you so much, and also good to speak after my neighbor from Eswatini. The title or the topic that I want to explore is understanding systemic risk for urban resilience planning and management. And what I can, sorry, it doesn't look as if I can advance the slides, but thank you. If we can just go to slide number 2. Right, so in Cape Town, the effects of the COVID-19 epidemic and the response to it laid bare the interconnectedness of socioeconomic activity and the vulnerability of a population already under resource duress. With people confined to their homes and much of the economy curtailed, income streams collapsed, and food security and accommodation tenure, especially accommodation tenure, quickly became an issue for many. And a cascading collapse of the socioeconomic fabric and resilience of the community became an issue. And it was that collapse was a real threat. And in lower income communities, desperation and frustration really grew. So government support and concerted efforts to rebuild food security in impoverished areas brought some relief, but a combination of entrepreneurial, informal landlords, opportunistic groupings, and regulations that sought to secure rental housing tenure during the pandemic resulted in massive occupation of marginal land, creating new conditions of vulnerability. So on the next slide, you can see the result. If we go to that, and really it is people were moved out of their lodgings, also informal lodgings, because they could not pay rent, and were forced to then move into other areas which are prone to flooding. And flooding risk became flooding reality when the winter ensued, and many people were firstly very vulnerable, and secondly very much impacted by the situation. So if we go to the next slide, in terms of understanding the systemic risk, so that system basically broke down, and the result was that disaster that you saw now. But to understand systemic risk and to really influence it and to move from science to policy, we need to understand that we can really influence risk. And layered risk assessment with a focus on risk construction, how risk is constructed, and the adjustable variables that make up risk, not just what are the top 10 hazards, is important. We need to do that layered risk assessment, and we need to prepare for those, and we need to look at the elements of risk. A targeted, almost surgical approach to finding the tipping points in the system and intervening at that point at strategic, tactical, or operational level is also very important. And then understanding relationships and interdependencies in the system and influencing long-term planning, such as spatial development plans, integrated development plans, strategies, and business plans to address that risk. And then also working tactically and operationally with stakeholders on a seasonal or hazard-specific basis to shape risk reduction and response. So in the city, we have a winter preparedness team that comes together and tries to, first of all, reduce risk, and then secondly, if that risk that cannot be reduced, to actually respond to the impacts. And that's a seasonal collaboration, which we also, we have the same model for specific hazards, one of the 30-odd major hazards that's been identified for the city in dealing with those. So institutional capacity is also important. You need to have your institutional capacity in place for risk reduction. In our context, that means an advisory forum for disaster risk reduction for the metropolitan area. It means that we have a disaster risk management center as per our South African Disaster Management Act, and that we have risk reduction and preparedness planning groups coming together for dealing with specific hazards and specific issues on the risk reduction side as well as on the preparedness side. We have community structures, we have volunteers participating, and the whole thing is this whole of government and whole of society approach. We need to understand that as disaster risk reduction practitioners, we can influence, we cannot do this alone, of course. We need to try to influence the system, and we can influence the system by making sure that we know whose actions can reduce disaster risk, even if it's not our actions, it could be someone else's actions, and we need to try to leverage and activate and start that off. And if we can do all of that together, then we can reduce risk. So those are my quick remarks, Chairperson. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Johan, again from Cape Town. But definitely, ladies and gentlemen, what we are seeing from the regional and national perspective is that the issue of disaster is being handled differently, but at the same time, there are these commonalities. We're talking about actually having data centers. We're talking about actually situation rooms. Having also talking about actually mainstreaming of this DRR at the government level, and also the issue of partnerships. Partnerships are coming in very, very handy. And so definitely, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very much happy that we have managed to get our host speakers to give their own views on views. We have some 15 minutes in order to enable you to ask any questions. But when I look at the chat, there's one question, for example, for Gema, and this one is saying, is it possible for OCHA to share the attribute dataset on hotspot location, in other words, geo-coordinate, a humanitarian response in needs and other statistical information? I'll repeat the question, Gema. Is it possible for OCHA to share the attribute dataset on hotspot location? In other words, it's geo-coordinate, humanitarian response in needs and other statistical information for mapping. Gema, is the question clear to you? But also to our colleagues, there's the issue of data that needs to be standardized. The issue of making sure that the data needs to be harmonized as well. So please, if any of you are interested in, can respond to that, please feel free. But first, Gema, this response in the chat, if you are ready, please. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'll put two websites into the chat here, which I hope can be copied across to the main chat. So two things. One is that in general, for data, we now have the Humanitarian Data Exchange. And I'll share the link for that. And at that site, you can find detailed data sets. You can search by theme, by country, and you can find the source of the data, the date of the data. Everything is there and fully attributable. So that's one. And then the second one is for everyone to be aware that for countries with major humanitarian emergencies, that is to say for ongoing responses, let's take, for example, Somalia, South Sudan, etc. We produce what we call humanitarian needs overviews, and those are also publicly available. So, Chair, I'll pop a couple of links in the chat box, and then if anyone has further questions, very happy to answer.
Very much, and even even to all of you, if you can share your contact details, please, that would be great. Okay, and then there's also a question again in the chat box. This one is for ICPAC. Yeah, ICPAC. Ahmed. The question is, an important component in the regional cooperation is transboundary risk management. For it to be possible and meaningful, member states need to share key data and information. What lessons, do you draw from ICPAC's work on transboundary risk management? Okay, is the question okay, Ahmed?
Yes, it is, Mr. Chair. Okay. Thank you very much. And
while you are preparing for that one, there's a question for Sintre. question says here, what mechanisms, Cynthia, what mechanisms and institutional arrangements, what mechanisms and institutional arrangements seem to be valuable in addressing systematic risk in Eswatini? I'll repeat the question. What mechanisms and institutional arrangements seem to be valuable in addressing systematic risk in Eswatini? And the last question, Johan, for you, it says, what kind of tools, risk assessment methodologies, and risk information do urban managers and your planners require in order to be able to address disaster risk in the city? These are the questions which I've just said. If you want, you can also check in the chat box. But okay, so Ahmed, the question for you on the regional cooperation transboundary. Please, Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, again for the opportunity. Two things. I think number one is the transboundary nature of risk. As we all understand, I think we are saying it over and over again, disasters know no borders. What does that mean is, for example, a classical example is desert locust, for example, starting from Asia to the Horn of Africa. So I think that's the way we have to understand. When it is in Asia, there must be a way we anticipate this risk coming and putting in place important mechanisms. On data sharing, Mr. Chair, I'd like to bring two examples. Number one is ICPAC, as a regional intergovernmental body, receives meteorological station data from member countries for about 100 plus stations. This really helps us to, in our modeling work, and also blending with satellite products, which is very important in terms of improving the precision and the accuracy of the data. That's one. But also we have developed, for example, a regional strategy on flood risk management together with member states, how the upstream, downstream issues of flooding can be handled. That is, I think, very important. And countries are already, some of our countries are already cooperating, particularly when the discharge is exceeding certain limits. I think they are sharing data to the downstream countries for preparedness purposes. But in order to improve the lead time, we are also working on a modeling, particularly hydrologic and hydraulic models, in order to provide more lead times in terms of forecasting floods. This is coming from ICPAC in-house modeling, as well as the global centers. This is how we deal with it. But on data sharing, countries are sharing, for example, met station data, but we want to advance it to more, for example, gauging station data and some others, which requires a special protocol to be signed with all countries, or at least between countries of interest, 2 or 3 countries together. So that is the way forward. We are looking at it, Mr. Ramos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tonga, about actually sharing of data, very, very critical. And then, for Cynthia, if I can repeat the question, it says, what mechanisms and institutional arrangements seem to be valuable in addressing systemic risk in Eswatini, systemic risk Eswatini? Please, Cynthia, what are your views?
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. Actually, we in Eswatini, we are working on strengthening the National Vulnerability Assessment Committee to ensure that we expand the scope as well, so that it will not only focus on a food security related actually data, but should venture into other forms of risk in terms of conducting their assessments. Right now, we are having a training that is going on, whereby we are incorporating the climate change dimensions into vulnerability assessment in our country. So this will, at the end of the day, ensure that we come up with a systematic approach to effectively manage risk in the country. So another aspect that we are working on is to come up with an information management strategy for sure, the Vulnerability Assessment Committee, and particularly the terms of reference or the Vulnerability Assessment and Analysis, will be incorporated as part of the key element that will be addressed in that strategy. And one thing that is key is for us to develop sector-specific databases and data sets and agree on indicators, because at this stage, it's more like the situation is kind of haphazard, but we are still trying to make some means to establish some convergence so that we can achieve some commonality in the way we interpret actually our data sets. So another aspect that was key that we have realized in the country in terms of managing risk effectively is that we have transited the Disaster Management Agency into a semi-autonomous entity, because it was proven that when it was still within a government department, it couldn't achieve a flexibility and rapidity. So basically, we had to ensure that it becomes a semi-autonomous entity so that it can be in a position to achieve those emergency response turnaround times in an event there is an onset. I have also explained, I think, in my previous presentation that we are operationalizing as well as deploying the National Emergency Operations Center that will be linked to the SADC Humanitarian Operations Center. So we want to ensure that we build it, we equip actually that center, as well as build the capacity or amass the necessary capacity to ensure that we facilitate hazard monitoring in real good time and facilitate information sharing in good time to all our partners. Earlier on, I also alluded to that we implement our mandates within a sector-wide approach. We have established sectors of our economy that are managing risk. We are having the agriculture and food security sector, the health and nutrition, education, as well as others that are being chaired or that are being led by the relevant line ministry in government and all entities within the UN agencies, as well as the NGO sector and the private sector right now, because we have seen the private sector contribution being pronounced during the COVID-19 emergency response. So basically, we are strengthening that a sector-wide approach with those development sectors by establishing now technical working groups that will be focusing on specific themes under each sector to ensure that our response mechanism is enhanced. So basically, without mentioning issues of revising archaic policies as well as establishing Act of Parliament, I can allude to those mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, time is not on our side. We only have about 3 minutes to do. So, Johan, please, in 2 minutes, okay, you can just answer, please. You are an expert already. So the question to you, Johan, is what kind of data, tools, risk assessment methodologies, and risk information do urban managers and your partners require in order to be able to address disaster risk in Cape Town? In 2 minutes, please, or less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairperson. What those colleagues of us need, the urban planners, is an overlay. They need a spatial overlay indicating risk, indicating what special measures needs to be implemented for those specific areas. So if you can come to that kind of product where you have an overlay on GIS to give your city planners and to give your urban managers, that's where you want to be. And you get there through using multi-hazard risk assessment, by trying to combine community-based interventions and community-based risk assessment outcomes with the science-based outcomes. And looking at the hazard, the vulnerability, the capacity, going into the resilience terminology of shocks and stresses, and trying to get those into a spatial format where you can say, yeah, this is where it's going to happen, and this is what's going to happen. I just want to also mention that we have, linking to our National Disaster Management Center and Provincial Disaster Management Center here in the city, we have our Center also has an operations center that looks at that receives early warning. And one very good product, for example, is the impact-based early warning that we are receiving from our South African Weather Service that indicates not what the weather will be, but what it will do. And once you know what it will do, then you can respond to that. And there is also in South Africa a national guideline on risk assessment that was produced by the National Disaster Management Center. And really it weighs in those different aspects of disaster risk as evident in the definition of disaster risk, which we all share from a UNDRR perspective. Thank you so much, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much to you all. I'm afraid time is not on our side. We have to go to allow the next session to take place. But this has been a very interesting discussion from my perspective. Very brilliant responses, and we have resource persons. So definitely, please, like I said, avail your links, or even your contact details so that follow-ups can be made. So definitely, thank you very much for participating in this. And so we are now allowing others to come in. We're talking about data, we're talking about information, we're talking about partnerships, we're talking about institutions, and so we're talking about the total value chain of DRR. So I think with this, I'll hand over back to the organizers. Once again, for me, to all the panelists, including the interpreter, thank you very much. Have a good day.